I want to start with a scenario that I think everyone listening has experienced, probably, I don't know, within the last week.
Okay, I'm listening.
You're driving home from work. It's a route you've taken 1,000 times. You pull into your driveway, you turn off the engine, and then it hits you. You have absolutely no memory of the last 20 minutes.
Ah, the classic highway hypnosis. It's a universal experience.
Right. But here's the thing that always trips me up about it. You were clearly, you were driving, you stopped at red lights, you used your turn signal, you probably navigated a pothole or two. Your brain was working.
Completely.
But you, the conscious narrator, the voice in your head, weren't really there.
It feels like a gap in consciousness. But mechanically, the brain was fully engaged.
Exactly. And that feeling, that separation between doing and narrating is exactly what we are unpacking today.
Yeah.
We've got a really fascinating document on the table.
Right. It's titled Structural Model of Thought Without Continuous Self-Referential Monitoring.
That's a mouthful.
It's a dense title, I'll give you that. But the architectural blueprint it lays out is incredibly significant.
It basically challenges a whole assumption that to be thinking, you have to feel like you're thinking.
That is the core of it, yeah. We tend to assume that the voice in our head, that constant, I am doing this, I am seeing that, is the thinker.
That is the thinker.
But this source argues that the I is actually just a monitoring system. It's not the driver, it's the backseat driver. And more importantly, the car drives just fine without it.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately because that is a huge claim. The idea that the voice in my head isn't doing the work.
Yeah.
It's just grading the work.
Precisely. And I do want to set the stage here early on. The document is very explicit that this is not a spiritual guide.
Right.
It isn't suggesting you go sit on a mountaintop and, chant until your ego dissolves.
No incense required for this one.
No, this is a structural, mechanical explanation of how the brain is configured. It posits that you can have a state where that subjective sense of I is dialed way down.
But you still function.
Perfectly. Your logic, your language, your behavior, they all remain perfectly intact.
Which just sounds so contradictory to how we experience life. If I am not there, who is doing the logic? Who's solving the problem?
That is the question. And to understand that, we have to look at the players in the network. The source breaks the brain down into a few key components, and it's the way they interact that changes everything.
Okay, let's meet the team. Who are the main characters in this neural drama?
First, we have to talk about the DMN, the default mode network.
Okay, usually when we hear about the DMN in pop psychology, it's the daydreaming network. Right?
Oh, exactly.
The thing that turns on when you're not doing a specific task.
Yeah.
It's usually the villain in articles about productivity.
That is the standard definition. It's associated with mind-wandering, self-referential thought. But this source makes a critical distinction that I found really illuminating. It argues that the DMN actually has two distinct functional layers.
Okay, 2 layers?
Yes. There is the generative layer and the recursive layer.
Okay, break that down for me.
So the generative layer is the engine. It's responsible for language, abstraction, connecting ideas. It creates models of the world. When you're brainstorming, this is the part that actually thinks the thought.
So the generative layer is the creative writer.
You could say that, yeah. Then you have the recursive layer. This is the monitor.
Don't worry.
Its job is evaluation, consistency checking, and most importantly, tagging the output as mine.
So if the generative layer is the writer, the recursive layer is the editor hovering over their shoulder with a red pen.
That is a perfect analogy. The generative layer says, here's an idea. The recursive layer says, is this consistent with who I am? Is it safe? Let me stamp my name on it.
And the source is saying these two don't have to be glued together.
Exactly. That's the breakthrough. You can have the generation without the recursion. You can have the thought without the self-tagging.
That is a wild concept. So the thought just exists, but the I made this label isn't applied to it right away.
Right. And to understand how that works safely, we need to bring in the next player, the Salience Network, or the SN.
Okay.
Think of the SN as the scout.
The scout. I like that. What's its job?
The scout detects relevance. It scans the environment, internal and external, for novelty, for threats, for anything important.
So it's the radar system.
Yes, but here's the nuance the source emphasizes, and this is crucial. The Salience Network is pre-identity.
Pre-identity. What does that mean?
It doesn't evaluate who you are. It doesn't care. It only detects priority. It works perfectly fine, even if you aren't thinking about yourself. If a baseball is flying at your face,
Right.
The scout detects the trajectory and triggers a flinch response before your self has time to say, I see a ball.
It just sees threat and says, move.
Cuts out the middleman.
Precisely. And finally, we have the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
The big boss.
Yeah.
The CEO of the brain. Usually, yes. That's how we think of it, the center of higher thought. But the source corrects this a little. It says the PFC is not the generator of thought. Remember, the DMN's generative layer is doing that.
So what's the PFC doing then if it isn't coming up with the ideas?
It's a regulatory system. It's for exception handling, applying rules, social responsibility. It's the manager who steps in when things get complicated or, dangerous.
Okay, so just to recap the board here, we have the creative writer, which is the generative DMN.
Yep.
The editor, the recursive DMN.
Hmm.
The scout, which is the Salience Network. And the manager, the PFC.
Correct. And the document outlines 2 different ways these players can be configured.
Let's start with the one we're all used to. The document calls it the standard configuration.
The continuous recursive model, yeah.
Yeah.
This is basically how most of us feel most of the day, especially when we're stressed.
Sure.
In this model, the process is very linear, very heavy on supervision. A stimulus comes in, the scout detects it. Then the generative layer creates a thought. But before that thought goes anywhere, it hits the recursive layer.
Editor steps in.
Immediately. It evaluates the thought, checks it against your identity, justifies it. Then the manager, the PFC, might tweak it for social safety. And only then do you get an output.
It sounds exhausting when you describe it that way. It's like a bureaucracy.
It is high cognitive load. The source notes this configuration creates a strong sense of authorship, that feeling of I'm thinking.
Okay.
But the cost is slower, stepwise reasoning and way more rumination.
It's like having that boss who demands to see every single email before you're allowed to hit send.
Yes. It's secure, it ensures social compliance, but it's slow. And it creates a lot of noise. You're processing the problem, but you're also processing yourself solving the problem. That takes energy.
Okay, so that's the standard model. What is the alternative? Because the title of the source is Thought Without Continuous Self-Referential Monitoring. That sounds like the boss has left the building.
Or at least the boss has decided to trust the employees. This is configuration B, the non-continuous recursive model.
How did this flow work?
Stimulus comes in, scout detects it, generative layer processes it, and then output.
Whoa. No editor, no manager.
They're on standby. They aren't hovering. The PFC and the recursive layer only step in on demand.
So if the thought is normal and safe, it just goes.
It just flows. The source describes the subjective experience of this as subjective silence.
Subjective silence. That sounds lovely, but also a little empty. I think people might confuse that with being blank.
Well, that's the biggest misconception. You might think silence means nothing is happening, but the source is adamant. Language and abstraction remain fully functional.
This is the part that really surprised me. Usually when people talk about quieting the mind, they mean stopping the internal monologue entirely.
Yeah.
Like no words, just vibes.
Right.
But this document says you can still use language. You can still do math.
Yes. You aren't zoning out into a vegetative state. You're processing information, solving problems, even forming sentences. You just aren't engaging the commentary on those sentences.
So it's not, I am thinking about this math problem. It's just the math problem being solved.
Exactly. It turns the process from I think that I think into just direct insight. I mean, think about when you're reading a really good book.
Okay.
You aren't sitting there thinking, I am reading a word, now I am reading another word. You're just hallucinating the story. The you disappears. But the language processing is firing on all cylinders.
That's a great example. You're processing complex syntax and plot points, but there is no narrator saying, good job reading, buddy.
Exactly. The generative layer is doing the work perfectly well without the recursive layer needing to sign off on every page.
But I have to ask the obvious question here. If the manager is on standby and the editor is taking a nap, doesn't chaos ensue? I mean, don't we need that filter? If I'm in a meeting and I turn off my filter, am I not going to say something regrettable?
This is a very common fear. If I let go of the I, won't I do something crazy? But the source explains why the system doesn't crash. It has to do with the on-demand nature of the regulation.
Is it because of the scout?
That's a big part of it. The Salience Network is still fully active. If a car swerves in front of you, the scout triggers a reaction instantly. It doesn't need yourself to slam the brakes.
Right. Physical threats are covered. But what about social threats?
The PSC hasn't vanished. It's just in a different mode. The source calls it on-demand regulation.
So just lurking in the background.
Think of it like the lane keeping assist in a modern car. It's not steering for you every second, but if you start drifting out of your lane or if the camera sees a barrier, it wakes up and corrects you.
So if I'm in that flow state during a conversation, and suddenly the topic shifts to something sensitive,
The Scout detects the novelty or the social risk markers. It jolts the PFC awake. The recursive layer kicks in. You enter the standard model, and you carefully choose your words.
so it's dynamic, you shift between them.
Ideally, yes. But the argument here is that for a huge chunk of our cognitive tasks, conceptual reasoning, memory retrieval, technical work, even casual banter, we don't actually need the recursive self-check.
We don't need to brand every thought with a trademark symbol.
Exactly. And the document makes a crucial clarification. This isn't dissociation. It's not a pathological detachment. It's a reallocation of monitoring intensity.
Reallocation of monitoring intensity. That sounds like corporate speak for firing middle management.
In a way, it is. It's about efficiency. The brain feels quiet because the commentary is stopped, but the neural activity in the generative layer might actually be higher or more fluid because it's not being constantly interrupted.
That brings us to what this actually feels like, the texture of the thought. The source draws a really interesting contrast between the output of the two models.
Yes. The standard model output feels deliberative, cautious. It's constructed step by step. I think
It feels like work.
it feels like effort, but the alternative model output feels direct. The source describes it as insight-like.
Insight-like. I love that. It's that moment when the answer just pops into your head.
We've all had that. You're struggling with a problem, analyzing it to death. That's the recursive layer spinning its wheels, right? Trying to force a solution while also monitoring your own frustration.
Oh, yeah.
Then you step away, maybe go for a walk, you drop the monitoring, and suddenly, pop. The solution is just there.
And the source says that isn't magic. It isn't the universe whispering to you.
No, it's not mystical at all. It's simply the removal of recursive interference. The generative layer had the answer. The recursive layer was just blocking the doorway, trying to check its ID.
That is such a compelling image. The idea that we are actually getting in our own way by trying to own every thought.
It shifts self-tagging from being a constant background noise, which uses up a lot of metabolic energy, by the way, into a conditional tool. You use it when you need it for like long-term identity or social justification, but you don't keep it running when you're just washing the dishes.
Wait, you just mentioned energy. Does the self actually cost more fuel to run?
Absolutely. The prefrontal cortex is an energy hog, maintaining a simulation of yourself, dragging your past and your future into the present moment just to oversee a simple task that is biologically expensive.
So when we feel drained after a day of meetings, it might not be the work itself. It's the cost of maintaining the mask.
That's a very valid hypothesis based on this model. The generative work, the actual thinking is efficient. The recursive work, the worrying about the thinking, is exhausting.
So if we look at the big picture here, what is the source really telling us about the nature of the self? Because it seems to be demoting the I from king to, I don't know, a bureaucrat.
It's offering a very functional definition. It suggests the self is essentially a recursive monitoring process. It's a loop.
A loop that slows things down for the sake of safety.
Correct. And when you stop that loop, the feeling of the self diminishes, but the thinking continues.
The disappearance of the felt self does not imply loss of thought. That was one of the boldest lines in the text for me.
It's a profound distinction. We equate being conscious with hearing that voice. We think, if I stop talking to myself, I cease to exist.
Right.
This model suggests the voice is just a secondary layer, a compliance officer, and the actual thinking happens just fine, maybe even better, without it.
It really makes you rethink those moments of flow. We usually describe flow as losing yourself. And that sounds almost dangerous, like you're losing control. But this frames it as losing the friction.
Losing the friction, yes.
Yeah.
And losing the lag. Without the lag of self-evaluation, solutions just appear with less perceived effort.
Less perceived effort. That's the dream, isn't it? To do hard work without it feeling like a grind.
And the mechanics support it. If you aren't spending glucose on the recursive check, you have more resources for the generative task.
It implies that we are capable of so much more if we can just get out of our own way. But I want to be practical for a second. The document is structural. It's a blueprint. But does it offer any clue on how to switch configurations? Because I can't just find a switch behind my ear and turn off the recursive layer.
That's the tricky part. Since it's not a self-help guide, it doesn't give you, 5 steps to flow. But reading between the lines of the mechanics, the switch seems to be driven by salience.
Salience, meaning what's important.
Yes. If the task is more important than the self, The brain naturally shifts. This is why extreme sports athletes or surgeons enter this state. The external reality is so high priority that the brain just says, we don't have budget for the ego right now, and shuts the recursive layer down.
Because if you're climbing a cliff face, worrying about whether you look cool is a waste of energy that could kill you.
Exactly. The Salience Network prioritizes the rock, not the self. But in our daily lives where physical threats are low, we tend to artificially inflate the importance of the self.
We treat an email like a tiger.
We do. And so the recursive layer stays on high alert, checking and rechecking, burning energy on a threat that isn't real.
That is a massive insight. The standard model prioritizes safety and social justification. It's defensive.
Yes, it's fundamentally risk-averse.
So if we're stuck in that mode all day, constantly monitoring, constantly tagging, we're essentially running a safety drill 24/7.
That is a valid interpretation. We are over-tagging. We are applying a mechanism designed for complex social navigation to, well, simple, mundane tasks.
It makes me wonder, and this is something for you, the listener, to chew on, if the self is essentially just a recursive monitoring process designed to slow down cognition for the sake of social safety. How much of our daily anxiety is just our brain over-tagging thoughts that would have been perfectly fine on their own?
But that is the provocative question. Are we micromanaging our own minds?
Exactly. Maybe the best manager is the one who knows when to leave the room.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best way to think is to stop trying to be the thinker.
That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for exploring the architecture of your own brain with us.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.